In today's video, you're going to learn everything you need to know regarding the addEventListener method in JavaScript. And say hi to my dog Ragnar in the back there as well. But first off, we're going to talk about what an event is. Then we're going to talk about what the addEventListener is. And then we're going to talk about how the addEventListener works. And then we're going to go over a kind of code sandbox example of using this. And just like off the top, there's going to be things I don't cover in this video, like bubbling, capturing, and different kind of event phases and other arguments you can pass to the addEventListener function, but I will cover those in future videos. This is more of a beginner video to give you kind of the fundamentals of how to add event listeners and how this method works within JavaScript. So first off, I think it's very important to understand, what is an event? Well, an event represents some action the user takes. This might be a click, a mouse drag, a key down, a drag over event, drag under event. Any of these events would qualify. And sorry, I'm just laughing at Ragnar in the background there. But all of these would qualify, and you can just Google what are the events in the web browser, and that will show you all the events. I like to use MDN, Mozilla Developer Network, and that will show you all the events. But with that, an event represents one of these actions, and this event will be represented as just a JavaScript object. So this event will take place, or the user will make some action, and then your web browser will emit just a JavaScript object that represents the event that took place. And within JavaScript, you can then use the data from this object and handle this event in some way. So this event will likely have a value of the event. It will likely have the name of the event. So for example, I know that in my professional application that we've worked on, we wanted to handle when the user presses space, we wanted to trigger some action on the web page. So I had to use the key down event. So when the user pressed that key down space, after that, I needed to use the event object to make sure that it was the space key, as any of your keys on your keyboard are going to make that key down event, but you might have to check the event and check a property on the event. I think it's the event code, which will tell you that, okay, the key character that was pressed was the space bar, and you can use that event object to then handle the event that occurs. So an example here would be that you might have a button within your application. The user clicks on that button, and then the web browser will emit an event or a click event. And this event will just be a plain JavaScript object, and it will have an event type that is click, and so on and so forth. So the way that you might use this is that, they might click the sign in button, and that event is going to be emitted. And once that event is emitted, you might navigate the user to a logged in homepage or something like that. All right. So it allows you to handle these events. And the way that we can kind of listen for, or the way that we can wait for these events to occur, is using this addEventListener method. So addEventListener is a method that allows you to listen or wait for some event to occur on an element and then handle that event. And the way that the addEventListener method works is that first you call the addEventListener method on a target. And this target can be an HTML element. So it could be a button element that you call it on. It could be the document object. So the web browser is going to create a document object based on the HTML that you send it. You could call the addEventListener on the document. You could also call the addEventListener on the window object. These could all be different targets in which you can add a event listener to. And just keep in mind that there are other ways to add event listeners within JavaScript. Like you can inline event listeners right within your HTML. So you could have a button, and as an attribute on that button, you could add a on-click event handler. However, this is the recommended approach to adding events within a JavaScript program, which is actually different than a React program, but understanding this will still help you understand React events and different things like that. But coming back to kind of that target element, the target is going to be the element that will kind of trigger the event or trigger the emission of that event object. So if you have a button within your application and you add an event listener on that button, well, that button is going to be your target. And if you are handling the click event, once that button is clicked, well, that button is going to be what triggers the emission of your event. So with that, the addEventListener has a few different parameters that you can pass. And as I said in kind of the introduction of this, I'm only going to cover the first two parameters that you can pass, or the first two arguments that you can pass to the parameters of this method. But keep in mind that there are other things you can do that I will cover in future videos when we cover, capturing, bubbling, different things like that. If that doesn't make sense, that's totally okay. We will cover that in future videos, all right? But the two main parameters that the addEventListener takes are a event type as well as a listener function. So when you call this method, you are going to pass it a event type, which is just going to be a string of the type of event that you want to handle. So this could be click, or it could be a key down event. Some of those events that I mentioned earlier, and you can, just Google a list of events in the web browser, and that will give you all the events that you can use. And you just pass a case-sensitive string, so case does matter. You pass a case-sensitive string as the first argument to addEventListener, and that allows you to handle that specific event. And then the second argument you pass to addEventListener is a function, and that function is going to be ran when that event takes place. So an example of this is on line 49, I declare a onClick function. And on line 53, say I have this button element here, and then this button element, this is going to be my target. So this is my target element, and I'm going to add an event listener on this button element. And the event type that I'm going to use here, my first argument, is going to be a click event. And then my second argument to the addEventListener is going to be a function that I want to run when this button is then clicked. So when this button is clicked, we're going to run this onClick function, which is just going to console log clicked. And I'll show you an example of this in just a second when I actually run some code live. So that is the very kind of basics of using the addEventListener. The first argument you pass to the addEventListener method is going to be a string that is the type of event that you want to handle. And then the second argument is going to be a function, or this will also be called a callback function because it's a function that you pass to another function to then be called at some later date. And this function that you passed will be called whenever this click event occurs on your target element. Now, with the addEventListener, you'll often want to kind of clean up after yourself, meaning you might want to run an event like once or twice, but you might not want to run it every single time that that event occurs. And to handle this, you can use the removeEventListener method. And it works very similar to the addEventListener method. You call the removeEventListener method on your target element, the same target element that you added the EventListener method to, and then you pass in the very same arguments. So you need to pass in the very same event type and the very same function. And then when you call this button element.removeEventListener, that is going to get rid of this event listener right here. All right, so to remove an event listener, you add the same event type that you added here, and then you pass in the same function that you added. But let's dive into an example of running some kind of live code here to make this kind of make a little bit more sense. So here I just have a JavaScript environment that allows me to write some code. And in this JavaScript file here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to retrieve a button element here. So in my HTML, I have a button with an ID of button. And in my JavaScript, I'm going to retrieve that button. And I'm going to use this button as my target element. So here on line 11, I'm going to call my addEventListener method on this button. And I'm going to add a click event. So my event type is going to be click, just like in my example within my code editor. And then I'm going to run my onClick function every time my button is clicked. So if we check out my web browser here and I open up my inspector and check out my console, when I click on this element, you can see that I console log clicked because this element right here is going to be my event target. And I have the event listener that waits for this click event that is going to run my function that just console logs click. Now, for an additional example of this, let's show you how you might remove an event listener and how that might potentially be useful. So here On line 13, I have a variable declared, and I just assign it to the value of 0. And then on line 15, I create a function, and it's called increment. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to add 1 to my resized variable here. And within my increment function, I'm also just going to console log my value of this variable, my resized variable. And then I'm going to call another function saying check if should remove. So this function is going to check, should I remove my event listener? And my check if should remove function, it's basically going to check if my resized variable here is greater than 10, then it is going to remove my event listener. All right. And my overall event listener, so I use the window here as my target element. And then the event I'm going to listen for is a resize event. So this is going to trigger this increment function to run here every time a resize occurs on my window. So anytime my browser is resized, so the width or height changes in my browser, it is going to trigger this increment event. But if my logic is correct here, which, who knows, if it's correct here, then this will only run 10 times. And after the 10th time here, if resize is greater than 10, it should remove my event listener. And I remove it by passing in my very same function here and the very same event type. So let's check if Ryan correctly did his logic here. And let me refresh this just to make sure we have kind of the clean state, and let me kind of resize my browser here. And as you can see, I console log my element here, and it console logs up to the value of 10. But now when I resize, it doesn't console log anything anymore because I have removed my event listener because the value of resized is now greater than 10. All right, so that is how you could potentially use some logic to kind of clean up after yourself and remove an event listener. And it's generally best practice to remove event listeners if you no longer need them. All right. Now, one key thing that is good to remember here is that in both of these instances here, I create a function declaration, but you can imagine that I could just pass a inline function here and perform my logic this way. And I could access my, resized variable, and I could increment it within my inline function. And you can definitely do this. However, the problem with doing this is when I go to remove this function, I can't really remove it because it's an anonymous inline function. I don't have anything to pass here as a label for a function to remove. So if you add an event listener that you then plan to remove at a later point, you're probably going to need to use some sort of named function so you can then pass in the label of that function to your remove event listener to then remove that event listener. As if it's just an anonymous function, you're not going to have anything to actually remove your event listener. All right. So hopefully that gives you a good understanding of the fundamentals of addEventListener within JavaScript. There's a couple of other things that are helpful to know regarding bubbling and capturing and different things like that related to event listeners, but I will cover those in, my next videos that I create. All right. So thanks for tuning in. I definitely appreciate it, and I'll see you in that next one.